Hi, everyone. Just give me a second so I will share my slides with you. All right. Just need to move things around a little bit. All right, so I think you're seeing the correct screen. Yes. Okay. So thank you so much for attending this session. So I'm Mélanie Brunet. I'm the Copyright and Affordable Learning Librarian at the University of Ottawa. And this session is about the benefits and challenges of conducting a program evaluation of an OER initiative. So I am joining you from Ottawa, which is the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So the full evaluation report is linked in the presentation description on the website. So you can access it there now or later. This presentation is not so much about the results of this particular evaluation of an OER initiative, but rather about how you can conduct a program evaluation. So here's some details about the OER initiative that was evaluated and is at the center of this presentation. So the program itself was launched in May 2020, and it officially ended on April 30th, 2025. The target population for the U Ottawa Libraries OER program were faculty members and part-time instructors at the university who, by participating in the program activities, created and used OER. And then the students benefited from the outputs of these activities. So the program was composed of tools, services, digital solutions, and a grant, and also training sessions and a community of practice, although those last two were not part of the evaluation itself. The period that was evaluated was from 2020 to 2024, so basically the first 4 years of the program before it ended. So why was the program established in the first place? So this was based on the needs that were identified at the University of Ottawa. So, and you'll see that they correspond to, there are two needs and that they correspond to the anticipated long-term results of the program. And just for context, the University of Ottawa itself is a public research university that offers courses, resources, and services in both English and French, and has about 48,000 students. So one need that was identified was a need for affordable course materials. And what is presented on the screen now is the average cost for required course materials per course by language of instruction. So if you multiply that by 10, which would be 5 courses per term, you'd get the amount that is basically expected, that students are expected to spend. So it adds up. That amount in French, the amount in French courses is lower because there are actually a lot of courses that do not use a textbook because it simply does not exist in French. So it looks like it's cheaper to study in French, but there are other, it's not as simple as that. But that was one need. And then that leads me to the next need, which was identified, was that for course materials in French. So currently, and it's been like that for a number of years, there are basically, we've noted that there are resources in English that are used in courses taught in French, that using resources that are from France or Quebec are usually somewhat culturally and sometimes even linguistically disconnected from the reality at the University of Ottawa and the students who are here. it's also difficult for students to get their hands on French language materials. That does exist because they sell out really quickly, or they're not available digitally, so they can only get print copies and the bookstore will run out quickly. And that leads professors to create their own notes, and they often do this in isolation from each other, and they do that when there's no textbook available in French. So that's the situation that we're trying to address. So what would we do a program evaluation? So ideally, it's to demonstrate an impact and to inform decision making. So like most OER initiatives, the University of Ottawa OER program was supported with public funds. So this evaluation was for transparency and accountability. And really, to keep receiving funding, it's important to get an idea of the return on investment. I know it's not all about um, money, but it certainly is a lot about it in terms of where we get the funding. So, so for example, we're talking about, savings for students, but not just about that. The number of resources created, retention and completion rates, all things that or indicators that you're familiar with. So in the library world and in education, we often use the word assessment, sometimes maybe means the same thing as an evaluation, sometimes it doesn't. But here I'm talking about program evaluation. It's a particular approach. And so I want to start with two definitions for you. So the first one is, what is program evaluation? Well, it's the systematic process of applying judgment criteria to data in order to determine the merit, value, worth, and significance of a program or intervention. And then what's a program or an intervention? It's a coherent, organized, and structured set of objectives, activities, and staff. So when conducting a program evaluation, usually three dimensions are examined, and that guides what your evaluation questions are going to be. So the first dimension is relevance. So it's basically the needs of the program that the program attempts to address, and also the alignment between the program and the organization's priorities. So that's the first dimension. The second one is effectiveness. So it's about the achievement of the anticipated results and also changes that are observed in the target population. And then the third dimension is efficiency. So here we're talking about the sound management of the program's human and financial resources, but also the relationship between the results that were achieved and the resources that were used to achieve them. So that leads me to the OER program logic model. So a logic model is a visual representation of the OER program in this case, its component and activities, and um, how they relate to the program's objectives and outcomes, short-term to long-term. There's a bit of a spoiler alert here. The program did not achieve its long-term goals, at least not at an institutional scale, but I think we reached the first level of intermediate outcomes. So the particular approach that I used for this evaluation is what is called utilization-focused evaluation. So because there are several approaches to program evaluation, but I followed this one because the goal of this type of evaluation is to provide useful, reliable, and timely information to encourage the use of the evaluation results and optimize the implementation of the recommendations. Because what we want is to limit the chances of the evaluation report basically being shelved. This particular approach is flexible. Because it prioritizes the expected users of the evaluation report, in this case, decision-making bodies or individuals. You can use mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative, to gather your data and analyze it. It also is flexible in terms of the scope of the evaluation. So what are you going to include in terms of its components, but also the period covered. And this type of evaluation can also be both formative, that is, with the goal of improving the program in real time, but also summative to assess the overall effectiveness of at the end of a program. So to perform a program evaluation, you need to develop an evaluation matrix during the process of defining the scope of your evaluation based on the program's logic model that I showed earlier, and it serves as a plan to conduct the evaluation. So an evaluation matrix will have 5 components or five elements. So there's the evaluation questions, which are the specific research questions to be addressed by the evaluation. Then there are indicators. So those are the concrete elements that will be measured to answer the evaluation questions. Then there's the success threshold or judgment criteria that are basically standards or targets to be achieved. There are the data sources, and some examples include administrative data, secondary data, public documents, computer data, financial data, the program participants themselves, and then the methods to analyze this data. So it could be secondary data analysis, literature review, surveys, semi-structured interviews, and others. So it's important to keep in mind that there may be multiple indicators per question, and there are also multiple criteria per indicator, and of course, a variety of data sources and methods. So if you want to see the full evaluation matrix, I invite you to check page 24 to 27 of the evaluation report. But I'm going to go into this to a bit more detail. So these are examples of 3 questions that were asked in this evaluation. So the idea is to ask questions that are not going to be answered by a simple yes or no. So I find that starting with to what extent did blah, blah, blah may be helpful. So here's an example for each dimension. So relevance, effectiveness, and efficiency. So I asked, what are the needs of university students for affordable course materials? And how have these needs changed since the OER program was first implemented? So that was a relevance question. Effectiveness among faculty and instructors who have interacted with the OER program. To what extent has there been a change in behavior regarding the use of OER? And efficiency, to what extent does the OER program have the necessary resources to carry out its planned activities? So overall, I had 9 questions, 3 about relevance, 5 about effectiveness, and 1 about efficiency. There are really no set number of questions. It will really depend on your access or even the existence of data. So that may force you to reduce the scope of your evaluation, also the time available to perform the evaluation. And if you have a team to perform the evaluation, or if you're just doing it solo, that has an impact on how many questions you can ask and answer. So my recommendation here would be to focus on what you think is absolutely necessary to know for those who have the power to make decisions about the program's future. So in terms of indicators and threshold and criteria, I'm using an example here. So it was question 8. Among faculty and instructors have interacted with the OER program, to what extent was there a change in behavior? So what you see next are in the indicators. And here, the COOP and SCOPE frameworks were very helpful in identifying indicators and making sense of them. So, there's an indicator that's perception and 2 that are about numbers, so more about usage. But then how do you decide what your success thresholds are, or your judgment criteria. So you don't want to set yourself up for failure with unrealistic targets, but what does success look like considering all you know about the initiative and its context? Was this discussed in the original project plan? Um, but you don't have to have, you also don't want to have a criteria or have criteria that give a false sense of success either. So it can also be the case that the thresholds or criteria have already been provided by the institution or entity who is interested in the evaluation results. So these thresholds and criteria can be a predetermined number, percentage or proportion, or finding out an average, a total, the presence or the absence of something, an increase, a decrease, positive perceptions. So it can be a lot of things. So in terms of the sources and methods, so specifically in this case, I relied on the program documentation and data, so financial data, including the project proposals, because there was a grant involved. So what the proposals were, the reports from the recipients at the end of their project, but also research that I had done earlier about textbook costs and student spending to address the relevance part in um, of the evaluation, among others, but also the program participants themselves. And so in between the grant applicants and recipients, the email and consultations that I did with professors, reported OER adoptions, active Pressbooks users, I eliminated duplicates and I ended up with 127 participants. And I also relied on reports about the post-secondary education in Francophone minority context, which is the one that the University of Ottawa is in. And then in terms of methods, there was documentary analysis, secondary data analysis. I did an online survey with participants. 28 of them replied. And I also did semi-structured interviews with 5 program participants. So that brings me to the benefits part. I think one of the benefits is that it offers a systematic approach. And I think that to be taken seriously, it's preferable to have a scientific, objective, rigorous approach that leadership and decision-making bodies are more inclined to consider. And keep in mind that program evaluation is a field of expertise and a profession. There is an American Evaluation Society, there's a Canadian one. They hold conferences, they publish journals. So it's something that's recognized. Another benefit is that you're basically speaking the language of leadership at your institution or organization. So in program evaluation, we talk about relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, costs, savings, return on investment, performance, accountability. Those are all concepts that correspond to the vocabulary of institutional leadership and government bodies and in a neoliberal context. So it's not just a vocabulary specific to libraries or open education. Another benefit, hopefully, is that it promotes informed evidence-based decision-making. And finally, because program evaluation draws on a variety of social science methods and approaches, there is flexibility to integrate disciplinary theoretical frameworks, such as, in this case, the COOP framework, in the SCOPE framework in open education to determine the indicators and also how to analyze them. So for example, in this evaluation, I relied on social justice, costs, use, perception, and engagement. And then finally, oh, yes, I'm almost done. Finally, there's the challenges. So one big one was the was evaluating your own program. So I completed the evaluation as part of a master's degree in education at the University of Ottawa, and I was the coordinator of the OER program. So yes, it made it difficult to remain objective, but I also had knowledge of the program that an external evaluator would not have had. So so I had very high expectations, but my thesis supervisor helped me strike a balance. Um, Then also when deciding to evaluate a program well after its implementation, and which makes it a bit of an afterthought, there's some necessary reverse engineering that needs to happen. So when you create your logic model, you identify the needs, the objectives, the data that's available. So ideally, a logic model should be part of the planning and implementation of a program, so you have to do it after the fact. Then there's that in the world of OER, voluntary reporting mechanisms are common, and it has a significant impact on the availability and quality of the data that I could access. There's no obligation to report the use of OER at my institution or at the provincial level. And of course, that complicates calculating the return on investment, but also the changes in behavior. So you try to get to those by talking directly to participants, using a survey, interviews, focus groups, trying to find substitutes and proxies. Then there's our changing circumstances that will occur while you're doing the evaluation. When I prepare for this evaluation, um, it was decided that the program was going to end due to budget cuts. So I went from evaluating something that I thought was going to keep going to evaluating something that was going to end. So that changed the mood a little bit. But while I was doing that, there were other developments, such as the Ministry of Colleges and Universities in Ontario issuing a directive for all publicly funded post-secondary institutions in the province, requiring that the price of all course materials be indicated in course outlines and encouraging educators to use OER. So that renewed the interest in affordability and, by extension, OER as a way to address it. And then finally, keeping it manageable. So there's the scope, in terms of scope and time. Um, so limited time and resources to complete the program evaluation was my issue here. And it wasn't part of the organizational culture to do an evaluation. So, and sometimes there's a pressure of a quick turnaround. So choices have to be made, like not consulting some stakeholders, not evaluating all components of the program. But it's important to be transparent about these. And these are my final thoughts. I don't know if I have time to go through them or not. But some final thoughts, get an outside perspective if you're evaluating your own program. So it could be a colleague who's familiar with research methods, but at least get your data collection instruments validated by someone else. Be strategic in your recommendations and take advantage of developments during the evaluation or things that you can foresee to a certain extent. And share your evaluation report as much as possible. So share it publicly and widely for transparency and accountability, but also it serves as a model to comparable initiatives in higher education. And finally, be prepared to talk about the main findings and recommendations at every opportunity. So have some talking points ready for your or an evaluate or an elevator speech. So in my case, there's something about, for each dollar invested by the library, the students saved at least $10. So so that's one way of and pulling other things that you think might be what might grab attention. And that's it. So thank you very much. If you have any questions about this presentation, the evaluation, or you are curious about evaluation approaches, things that you might want to read about, please email me, and I'll be happy to help with that. So I can be reached at melanie.brunet@uottawa.ca. Thank you.